It's a line that we heard from Wall Street critics since the recession hit us in '08 like a overhand right hook. Now, from lawmakers to all the way to Occupy Wall Street, it was break up the banks. They got too big to fail. Now, that rallying cry, it's gotten some new momentum, and thanks to a guy that probably a few years ago would be the last person you ever would have expected to be saying it. His name, Sandy Weill. While former head of Citigroup, he made his name in part on the push to repeal a Depression-era regulation known as Glass-Steagall. Now, Glass-Steagall, which you may remember from Econ 101 in college, it was repealed in '99, but what it did was it had put a wall between commercial and investment banks so that the banks where you make your deposits can't risk your money as they make trades for themselves. Now, the repeal makes a fortune for the banks here, but a lot of folks say also made a mess of the financial system. So, Weill pushed for that change in law in '99, got what he wanted, but here's what he's saying now.
I think what we should probably do is go and split up investment banking from banking, have banks be deposit takers, have banks make commercial loans and real estate loans, have banks do something that's not going to risk the taxpayer dollars, that's not going to be too big to fail. We can't have a world where it's impossible to make a mistake. If you make a mistake, you are really a bad person. Because if we do that, we're not going to have a world where anything happens right.
That's a pretty radical idea, though. The idea of breaking up the investment banks and the banks. Are you suggesting going back and really breaking these companies up?
That's exactly what I'm suggesting. So I want to see the United States be the leader. I mean, I really believe in our country, and we're not going to be a leader if we keep on trashing our institutions.
And for more on this, let's bring in our guest from Forbes magazine, Halah Touryalai. Halah, I appreciate a few minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard, for having me.
You know, I don't know what's more surprising, what Sandy Weill said or that the source himself, given his history. Did a lot of folks see this thing coming? Were they surprised, given especially, his history, especially at Citi, that Sandy, of all people, was the one saying, let's bring back Glass-Steagall here and let's separate the commercial and the, actual investment banking arms here. What surprised you more?
It definitely surprised me more that it's Sandy Weill coming out of completely left field and changing 180 degrees of what his position is on the banking system. That was definitely more shocking, the source of where it was coming from, indeed.
Now, people are attributing a bunch of different motives. Some say, hey, he found religion here after seeing, obviously, what went down in '08. Some people say this is, revisionist history to try and put a different spin, given some of the problems that happened, really, that we saw in the aftermath after he left. You're closer to the street than me. What are people saying as to why Sandy is saying it now?
It really depends on who you ask. There might be some political aspirations here, maybe a regulatory role. We saw Volcker happen. So maybe he's wanting to go down that path. But I think what's really important is historical context here. This is the guy who who went about merging a commercial bank with an investment bank when Glass-Steagall was still a law. He went and announced this huge merger between Travelers and Citi when Congress hadn't even repealed the thing yet. And they were almost forced by his announcement back in 1998 to go ahead and repeal it. He went ahead and did this before it was even repealed.
Now, he's hardly the only one saying, listen, trace back to our problems here, and when Glass-Steagall was in place, we didn't have these issues, and when it went away, the commingling, the super banks, if you will, certainly nobody needs too much of a history lesson with what went down in '08. How much of an appetite is there that it's not just Sandy Weill saying this, but there's other folks on Wall Street? They may not know how to unwind the banks, but they don't necessarily think that he's onto a bad idea because, like we said, he's not on an island.
Right. He's definitely not on an island here, but it's interesting because a lot of the calls coming to break these banks up is coming from former executives. We saw some of it coming from former JP Morgan executives, but what's important is the people who really know how to do this are likely the banks themselves, and that's not going, you're not going to see much help from the banks.
Is the big concern the unscrambling of the egg, in that how exactly, when they're so commingled, basically both disciplines of these super banks, both the investment and the commercial, how would you really strip them apart? And it sounds good in theory, but in practice, it's really, really hard to do. Is that the big issue?
That's definitely a huge issue. I mean, think about something like the Volcker rule that came out, where they wanted to simply ask banks to stop betting their own money, and they can't even figure out a way to write that. How are you going to separate all of these units that are so intermingled for the last over 10 years and separate them? And then B, what does it mean for a U.S. consumer who does a lot of overseas business? I mean, what do you do when a company is based in the U.S., has a Citi bank account, and does a lot of commercial banking, but also works with Citi on the security side? I mean, do you split his accounts up? It's not going to be in the best interest of a lot of business customers who do overseas business.
Hey, Halah, I appreciate a few minutes. You have yourself a good weekend. Thank you.
Thanks, you too. Thanks for having me.
All right. I know it's good. I know it would be hard, and I'm not even going to try and figure out the motivations for Weill saying what he is now, especially given his history. But it would make things a lot simpler. And a lot of people who follow us a lot closer than I do say, without a doubt, it is that commingling of investment and commercial banking that is a root of a lot of our problems. I can't imagine how difficult it would be to untangle the two, but if we could, and I don't see why we wouldn't be able to over time, I think we'd be better off for it.
There's one danger in doing that. It would certainly make the banking system safer, but the value and the profits that the financial industry has made since 1999 have exploded exponentially. Yes, it's a lot of paper profits, but it's still profits, and so you would be slowing growth, you would be slowing the economy by doing that, because these banks wouldn't be able to make the profits at the speed that they've been making them. However, I think a lot of people would trade a lower top speed for greater safety.
Well, I think
and this
the
is an
American
important
public.
part.
Let me just say this
Go
one
ahead.
thing. I think the question, Richard, would it lead to more regulation of banks?
Yes.
Then I think the American public would definitely support that.
But you know, there's a difference between more regulation and proper regulation. They should have never repealed Glass-Steagall. That was what started a lot of this problem. Dodd-Frank doesn't address the problem so far in the 48 plus enacted mandates that Glass-Steagall caused when they repealed it, that it caused. As for slow growth, the problem we had was that we went from a 5-to-1 to 17 to 21, 22 to 1 ratio, and we got a lot of paper money. By bringing it back to a sound footing, you may slow growth, but a more steady growth is a better future projection.
And I also think this much, if you just said to the American public, since 2008, nothing has changed with the banks, and arguably, you've even put more of an accelerator on. Nothing has changed culturally, and nothing has practically changed, as David was just saying, from a regulation standpoint. If people digest that, nobody wants to relive what we went through 4 years ago.